Good morning, everyone.
Hi there. Hi, folks. Welcome to today's NTAC session. Happy Tuesday. Happy October 1st. Happy fall. Today's session is titled Healing Centered Reunification, which is the first session of the Heartwork series. We will have several sessions throughout the month of October. And today, again, is Healing Centered Reunification. We are so happy that you're taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. And before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items to go over with you. But meanwhile, as folks are entering, feel free to enter your name, your organization, role, and where you're located into the chat as we get started. But again, welcome. Next slide, please. As oh, Thank you. As part of our session, we must provide you with this disclaimer. This presentation was prepared by NTAC under a cooperative, that word is so hard for me sometimes, cooperative agreement from SAMHSA. While this event is supported by SAMHSA, the contents are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent the official views of SAMHSA, HHS, or the US government. Next slide, please. We hope this doesn't happen. We don't foresee it happening, but if there are any security issues that happen during today's session, this session will immediately end and you will be notified by email on how to rejoin a new session. Thank you again for attending one of our NTAC sessions. As you could see on the screen, there are several organizations are listed as our incredible national partners who have come together to utilize their expertise and their subject matter knowledge to help inform the field by creating products, resources, and sessions like this one to enhance the behavioral and mental health fields. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. As a center, our vision is that all children, youth, and families living with and impacted by mental health challenges will have access to the resources and opportunities they need to thrive in a comprehensive and equitable system of care. We serve a wide cross-sector audience, including everyone from state leaders to providers to school workforce, infant and early childhood providers, community-based providers, peer supervisors, family partners, youth partners, and so much more. Our services range from individual consultation to more in-depth sessions like the one we are offering today, to peer learning exchanges and tools to help you. Our aim is to really create those outlets for communication, collaboration, and resource sharing amongst all of us. So please also make sure to check out all of our resources and archive presentations on our website. On the website, you can also find a contact us link there to request consultation or training. Next slide, please. Thank you, Lane. Before we get started, there are a few commonly asked questions that we get, so we wanted to address those before we start our session. You will be provided a certificate of completion after this event. Once it's all done, you'll get one. If you have joined by phone only today, please email Joanne Bloom at the email on the screen to report your participation. You will get a copy of this presentation in the follow-up email that you will be receiving. And you will also receive a recording of this event in the follow-up email. Alrighty. Well, we made it through the housekeeping items, and throughout while I was talking, I was very aware that I did not even introduce myself. My name is Griselda Ramirez, and I am a change consultant at Change Matrix. But that's all I'll say about me because today we'll be hearing from Lane and Asarin on about healing centered reunification, which is again kicking us off with the first session into our Heartwork series. So I will go ahead and hand it over to them for introductions and to give us an awesome presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We are both very excited to be here. Before we get into introductions, I'm really excited to introduce my co-facilitator today, but I really want to ground us into our land and labor acknowledgement. This is something that I don't feel right stepping into these spaces until we do acknowledge the different spaces in which we are occupying and the history behind that. I love reading the chat. We have 86 people live right now, which is absolutely so exciting. And also, as I see you come in and join, I see us from all different spaces throughout the United States. And so with that, I want to get us grounded before we jump in. It is one thing to be aware of the land that we are on, and it is another to be aware of the history. There's history of murder, eradication of people, land, language, and culture, and more. It is even more important to be aware that still within our current day, the individual and collective impacts Indigenous people face and fight, such as generational poverty, underfunded healthcare, systemic violence, and more. So I encourage you not only to identify the lands that you reside on, but please, I support and encourage you to challenge yourself and educate yourself on what current advocacy local Indigenous tribes and people are fighting for. Challenge yourself to continue to be aware and use your power and your resources to help restore historical Indigenous Native land, values, languages, and all that comes with the history in which we are still facing today. With that, I'm going to transition into our labor acknowledgement. This comes from the Office of Multicultural Affairs. So this one did not originate from myself, but I do want to acknowledge that we recognize the labor upon our country, state, and institution are built. We remember that our country was built on labor of enslaved people who were kidnapped and brought to the US from African continent. We recognize the continued contribution of their survivors. We also acknowledge the immigrant and Indigenous labor, including voluntary, involuntary, trafficked, forced, and undocumented peoples who have contributed to the building of the country and continue to serve within our labor force. We recognize that our country is continuously defined, supported, and built upon and by oppressed communities and peoples. We acknowledge labor inequities and the shared responsibility for combating our oppressive systems in our daily work. With that, that's why we're here. This topic drew you in for a reason. I'm going to make the assumption that many of us either have lived experience or professional experience working with those who have justice involvement. And so with that, I come to this space as my whole human self, acknowledging those things personally and professionally, and I invite you to do the same. Before we get started, we do have a great amount of content and also reflection that we're going to be supporting you all within. But I would really love to pass it over to a good friend, colleague, an incredible community advocate, someone who inspires me and uplifts communities in ways that we need. So Nazarene, if you don't mind introducing yourself, I would love to hand it to you.
Yes. Are you able to hear me? Is my audio good?
Your audio is good. I can't see your beautiful face, but that's okay if not, but I can hear you.
Okay. Can you see me? You can see me now. Beautiful.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Nazarene Ahmed. And like I said, like Lane said earlier, I come to this world through just naturally seeking knowledge and education. I come from a background where I haven't always had people in my corner to advocate for me and navigate spaces like these. So I'm really excited to be here. I come from my background includes direct experience and direct service work with youth in K through 12. Most of it comes from middle school and high school, and most recently doing school safety and threat assessment work with a lot of school districts in King and Pierce County. So my heart and soul is rooted in this work, and I'm really excited to speak to y'all about some of this healing-centered work we're here to discuss today. So excited to get to know everybody, excited to share knowledge and space. And I hope that we can all participate together. This conversation and discussion is really going to be as fruitful as we allow it to be. So I would really like whenever we ask for questions or participation or engagement, to please engage with us and share space with us. Thank you. I'll pass it back to Lane.
Thank you. Yes, so my name is Lane Krompos, she, her pronouns. I also come at this work very, very thankful for my opportunities. I got to work alongside Nazarene doing school safety work, but even beyond, I come at this from a personal and professional place, personal experience, lived experience, along with professional experience with family, all the things. And so it's something that I know I hold very true to my heart as far as we're going to talk a little bit about insider outsider feelings of when you're inside a system versus an outsider working inside and navigating that, especially the importance of healing centered. We hear a lot about trauma informed and what does it mean to shift beyond that space into healing centered practices. So very thankful for my years of experience working alongside youth and families, then to a macro level of systems change, policy work, and all the beautiful things that come with the opportunities we have when we are present in these spaces. So thank you again. And as Nazarene said, this will only be what we make it. So please, I invite you in. Let's have good conversation. Let's learn in community with one another. The chat, I love to see things moving. I see some King County representation in the room. That's amazing. That's Washington State. So that's where Nazarene is located. And then I am in Arizona, but formerly from Washington. All right, now to the good stuff. So a little bit about why we're here today. We are going to talk about what does healing-centered reunification mean. We often hear reentry. This is a common term used in the juvenile justice world of reentry into community, where reunifying is a little different, and we're going to talk about why. And then okay, thank you. So we're going to talk a little bit about why reunification and that language, especially healing-centered, matters in these spaces and places. Another thing is we're going to talk about the values of healing-centered practices and then frame the reunification phases through the lens of the water of systems change, which I will drop that gem of a resource in the chat at some point. But for now, we're going to carry on. When we're in this space for each other, I'm a strong believer in collective learning in person. I love to sit in circle. I love to still hold that essence as we're in our little Zoom squares and boxes. So with that, just some foundational things that I know I try and hold true in this space, but I would love to encourage you all as well. Have humility, speak your truth, respect this space. Using I statements, this is something, it's easy, I know for myself to say, we experience this, or we tend to be siloed in this system, versus stepping back and remembering that my truth is my truth. It doesn't mean it's the representation of the whole. And so coming from that place of this is my truth and where I sit in my experience. Have compassion for yourself and for others in these spaces. I think that this work is beautiful work, but it's heavy work too. It connects close to home for many of us. And so I always try and have some compassion and knowing it's not the end all be all with me. And that's why we're here in this collective. So hold that compassion for yourself and for each other. If you're sharing information, please acknowledge where the information and teachings come from. This is something that I know what I'm here today, even what I'm saying, it might be coming from my mouth, but there is teachings that have been brought to me through, again, personal and professional experience. And so I try and honor whether it's individuals or systems or what that might be, where did that come from and why? So I encourage you to do the same and reflect on where your teachings come from. We're going to introduce some different frameworks of thinking as we go through, because you'll see these themes come up. As I talked about showing up as your whole human self, I am my own human self. I'm a mom. I also work just like many of us that are in this space. So if you hear background noise or you see something pop up on my shared screen, just know that's life. It's living in real time right now. I don't get a pause. So bear with me. We're in this together. So with that, back to our themes, we're going to talk about transformative thinking. Transformative thinking is something that also can be seen maybe as disruptions of systems that have traditionally caused harm, especially when we're talking about justice involved individuals and families. And so we have what we often view as our status quo. And so if you look at that inner circle and what that means, and you look at some of those inner circle values, how does that tend to show up? Even if it's not within ourselves, but within the systems we work in and the systems we partner with, where do those values tend to happen? I know for me, I can easily catch myself in that sense of urgency, the perfectionism, and I see these different spaces. And then how do you shift beyond? So today you might catch yourself in that discomfort space, and that's okay. We're not going to get hurt in discomfort. We don't want to go to pain, but I invite you to shift out. So if we think of transformation, healing, which is all of what today is about, healing, liberation, possibility, that really involves us stepping into that wider circle and embodying some of those values. That way it shows up in our day-to-day. And Nazarene, if you want to add anything, please jump in as I go through these. The next framework I'm going to walk us through is the water of systems of change. So this, again, I will share the link in the chat. It's a full document you can read through, but we're going to talk a little bit about the implicit, semi-implicit, and the explicit, and how that shows up when it comes to reunification practices. So in my experience, and one of my roles supporting the reunification of youth who were coming out of long-term incarceration back into the community, this is something that it's easy to see in how our implicit, ourself, can then impact the explicit. Where do we have that structural change possible and the power to do so, and how it really starts the internal side. So we're going to walk through that as our model. Nazarene, I am going to hand it over to you if you want to introduce us into healing centered and allow people to reflect on that.
Yes. Is this like an open discussion amongst everybody? Like, can we ask the audience questions and get some responses back?
Yes.
Or some responses in the chat? I just want to start by asking, what does healing mean to y'all? In whatever sense of the word. Some parameters to give you is just when we're thinking about youth-centered work, what does healing mean? And if we can, I'm on a tablet, so I'm having issues with my video and viewing the chat. So if some of y'all could come off mute and vocalize your responses, that'd be super helpful.
I'll help as well. Christina looks like she's off mute. Christina, do you want to go first? Okay, I'll read some in the chat. We have freedom, resilience, moving forward with optimism, acknowledging the hurt and finding a way forward, choices, peace.
Absolutely.
Hope, change,
Yeah.
getting better. Anyone want to come off mute? I'd love to hear your voice into this space.
Calmness.
I look at healing as regenerating. Oh, somebody else.
Oh no, go ahead, Crystal. What were you saying?
I would say regenerating hurt, whether it be mental or physical, and into a positive.
We have some more. Thank you, Crystal. We have some more in the chat also. Restoring health, trust, putting yourself and your health first, moving on, advocacy, safety, inner peace, emotional safety with vulnerability. Love that. Acknowledging what has happened and moving forward, learning from experience and potentially being aware and able to avoid repeating it in the future.
100%. Thank you so much for all of those responses. All of those are great. Those are all some of the things that come to mind for me when I think about those, and a lot of the responses that I got today are responses I've gotten in the past. When I think about healing, I think about a lot of those components you mentioned. I think about vulnerability. I think about trust, and I think about how patience ties into all of those things. And how do we move from trauma-centered work and care to healing centered, right? How do we foster some of these components around healing and empower our students and our youth to really step into these spaces? So if we could go to the next slide. We're going to define reunification here. Reunified, reunifying, to unify again, to bring people or things, or to be brought into a unit or coherent whole after a period of separation. Okay, so when we put those two things together, it allows us to be able to shift beyond trauma-informed care to healing-centered care. And Lane, if you want to touch on this quote, feel free to interrupt, but this quote says, "I am more than what happened to me. I am not defined by my trauma." A lot of my experience comes from working with unhoused students students who've had encounters with the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system, and then those who have reintegrated into the education system, as well as most recently students who we've done threat assessments on, and who have been students of concern. One thing that I know I've realized in my experience interacting with these kids and these families is we define them by the situation and the circumstances that they're in, right? And a lot of times you're navigating life and you're navigating school thinking, all I am are these circumstances, all I am are these situations. One thing after another is happening. And it's important when we're doing this work and when we're providing resources and support for students who are reacclimating and reintegrating to the school, regardless of what experience has forced them out of that. How do we focus on possibilities? How do we allow students to understand that you are beyond just this circumstance or this one situation that has taken place, but that there are endless possibilities open for you on where life can lead you and where this path of education can lead you? How do we address what is underneath the behavior, right? We all know that every behavior that we see a student or a young person exhibit is a communication for something, right? What are we missing? Are there pockets of basic needs that are missing? Are there pockets of neglect or social emotional shortcomings within the student's life? How do we take a scope, a look at the bigger scope of the picture? How do we recenter students' culture at the core of their well-being? When we understand that a lot of our students who are going through trauma and navigating these systems are disconnected from themselves, right? We talk about how identity is so rooted in the core of who human beings are and who youth are becoming. How do we recenter that? How do we destigmatize cultures that we're not familiar with? How do we get closer to Black and Brown students? How do we get closer to Native students while using their culture as a place of space, safeness, support, but also a place of knowledge? We look at how our education system and our curriculum is built and how Eurocentric it is. We don't talk about our Native students and the rich culture and the history that they bring to this land. We don't talk about how African culture looks beyond just slavery, beyond just the hurt and the blood and the tears that are rooted in a lot of these cultures. How we live in the US, right? This country has been built on the enslavement of Black folk and the genocide of Native folk, right? So how do we bring in the love and the nature that's rooted in all of these different cultures and make it a place of well-being, a place of healing, a place of true identity for a lot of our communities? How do we find collective experience and participation? I know in the 10 years I've been working in education, a lot of the key behaviors I've seen in adults, including myself, is we tend to gravitate towards spaces where we feel comfortable and identify with, and we don't gravitate towards spaces where there's not a lot of identification there for us. Maybe there's not a lot of experience there for us, but it is a collective responsibility when we're talking about healing our youth, when we're talking about reintegrating youth into communities. How do we make it our collective experience, but also our collective responsibility to assist our students and their families in this? And the last piece is, how do we make this asset driven, right? What resources do we have? What access do we have? And how can we center students and families when we're talking about healing and stepping away, more so stepping away from just centering the trauma and constantly talking about the trauma, but how do we move towards true internal healing in a way that allows you to thrive beyond just K-12 or beyond just your next few years of college, but becoming a successful, thriving adult in the real world? Lane, do you have anything you want to add here?
Happy, does anyone follow that? Um, Beautiful and well said, Nazarene. Thank you. As always, I just appreciate the way you show up in our spaces. Yeah, I think I would ground us into is this thought of reunifying and what reunifying means. So if you think of the context and what Nazarene just shared, these different values about possibilities, what's underneath the behavior, being asset driven, culture, collective experience, what does that look like? When we think of Reentry, the term we commonly know, it is putting the accountability on one. If I use the term, I'm re-entering into something, that is my responsibility to walk into that space, to open that door, to step into that opportunity. Where when you think of reunifying and the definition of reunifying, it is to unify together. It puts accountability on everybody. And so when we're thinking of these different pieces, we also need to think about the different roles that come into play when it comes to the reunification process, because reentry traditionally and historically has been on one. It has been on that youth and family and on them alone to walk through that experience and navigate that world, versus reunifying is a unification on behalf of everybody. It is everybody that is part of that team, part of that table, part of that system that is involved in this youth and family's life to really reground and center themselves in these opportunities to be responsible also for that reunification process. Because when unification happens, it usually means that there was harm done on both sides. It is not just harm towards community, but it is harm towards youth and families also that has been done. And so there is trust that needs to be restored. And in order to do that, we do need to focus on these different values and how healing is so essential to repair harm that has been done on all sides. And this quote, that I am more than what happened to me, I'm not defined by my trauma, is something that there's an activity that stuck with me that I'll never forget. And it was where we were in this training and there was a room of, oh, how many people do we got in here today? Over 100. And it was similar to that. And it was where you wrote down on a sticky note your deepest secret and whatever that may be for you, something you maybe hold shame about, and you folded it up and you passed it. They told us pass it 4 people to the right, 2 people to the back, and over and around. And at this point, you have no idea where your sticky note went. And that experience, for anyone who doesn't have lived experience, I know for myself at many points in my life, it felt like that. It felt like people know only the deepest, darkest, shameful things happening in my life. They don't know me. They don't know my assets. They don't know my culture, my belonging, any of those things that are my strengths. But they know all these other stuff that I'm going through, that I've been through. And that experience reminded me of that feeling. And the intention was to help people who haven't had lived experience to reflect on how often we hold information about one thinking that is the story, where we don't know these other pieces. And that's where healing comes into play. Nazarene, did you want to expand on this slide or?
Can you actually go back to the previous slide? I wanted to touch on one more thing. I just wanted to elaborate a little bit on focusing on the possibilities and what are those possibilities. And when we're talking specifically about trauma and what has happened to a young person, we're talking about how trauma doesn't define their inner being, right? Their core self. You're valuable as a human being at the end of the day simply because you are a human being, right? Not because of the things that you've done or how you show up in the world or anything, right? So just focusing and understanding that trauma doesn't define your core, it doesn't define your essence. You can use your trauma as a tool, right, to move beyond just what has happened to you. But how do you use your trauma to create possibilities for others, create avenues and pathways to allow them to learn the way that you have and grow beyond just their circumstances, right? It allows you to see and change your past. How do you see beyond your past and create a future that's hopeful, a future that's rooted in dreams and goals and a life that's worth living and thriving in. But most importantly, I think the biggest one is just the possibility to heal. As human beings, we are so resilient and we are so strong, and our ability to understand that we've gone through situations similar to this where we felt fearful, where our flight fight response system has been activated and we've survived, we've gotten through it. So how do we use our past experiences and how we have been able to get through that as a push to allow us to maintain hope that we can heal. And lastly, that trauma doesn't have to control your life. These are all moments in time that we can take as adults in young people's lives to show them that these possibilities exist. Because when you're going through it, when you're in the thick of it all, it's hard to see that there are possibilities. It's hard to see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. So we constantly need that reassurance and that reminder that there are possibilities beyond just the circumstances I'm in right now. Next slide, please. Thank you. Healing-centered approach to addressing trauma requires a different question that moves beyond what happened to you, but more so what's right with you, right? Asking that specific question, what's right with you, and not what happened to you or what's wrong with you. It views those exposed to trauma as agents in the creation of their own well-being, right? I was just talking about the possibility that you can heal. You can heal from your trauma. You are more than just the pain that you're going through. You are the creator of that. You are the creator of your well-being, and just changing and shifting from the framework that they're a victim, being a victim of these traumatic events, but really more so being the creator or the storyteller of how do you move beyond this? How do we move forward? How do we center healing in the steps that we take forward? Lane, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, we had a really great comment in the chat. I don't really understand the reference between moving beyond trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care has a different role in this. And I would say yes, and it's yes, trauma-informed care is incredibly powerful. We want to be trauma-informed. We want to acknowledge in which our youth or families are stepping into and what their trauma experience is. And also, in my experience, I'm going to use I statements here. I have seen many times in which I've worked within systems and organizations where we're on this hype of, oh, we're doing in trauma-informed care. This is what we're implementing. This is what we're doing. And it's the so what? What does that do really beyond? Where do we come to a place of healing? Because I can do the things that helps, yes, navigate that experience for that individual in a different way, being mindful. That should never be dismissed. And also there's this essence that healing brings that we need to bridge and grow from, that I think really helps restore power within our communities in ways that trauma-informed doesn't. I say this for myself, trauma-informed to me is a non-negotiable. It's like, please and thank you, yes sir, like yes ma'am. Like it is a foundational for me that I operate within. And also when I think of how we step into places of centering healing it's a very different experience. Oh, I love that comment. It's like trauma is equality versus healing center is equity. And Nazarene,
Yeah,
did you want to?
yes. Absolutely. I just wanted to add on to what you wanted to say, and then we can go more into the chat. But the way I think about it and the experiences that I've had, all the students that I've worked with, both in schools and out of schools, when I think about trauma-informed care is how do we come into the room, right? Knowing that there's all these different students, all these different families, all these different young people that come from all walks of life, all different experiences, all different traumas, all different triggers, all different worries, right? How do we come into the room? We come into the room carefully by treading lightly, by being knowledgeable, by being aware and informed of making sure that you're not stepping on toes, making sure that you're not accidentally triggering or harming somebody in your space when you're encountering those young people. When I think about healing centered is how do we all leave the room together at the end of the day, right? We've come into this space to learn, we've come into this place to grow together, but how do we all make sure that every one of us walks out of this room together? When we're talking about how do we move beyond what happened to you, and we're talking about what's right with you, is what is the possibilities of what's coming next, right? How do we move forward? And it's not just how do we give this person the tools to move forward, it's how do we have a collective effort in this person moving forward, because it is all of our responsibilities to make sure that we're all healing and growing and supporting, because nobody grows together, nobody grows by themselves, nobody heals by themselves, or in isolation or in solitude. It's with community and it's through love that we learn and we grow. And it's only through healing and community and love that we all walk through that room. We all walk out of that room together. And so that's how I kind of just break it down, and it works in my brain. But I really appreciate that comment about equity versus equality.
I'm sure an experience. This was an experience actually, Nazrin, you were there. And what had happened was we got called to do a school threat assessment. And so for anyone who's not familiar with the threat assessment process, it's essentially, I'm gonna just really quick cliff notes because I know we got a lot of content to go through. It is where there is a supposed youth identified as a threat to the school community, and they call in a team to review the situation alongside each other to see what is the level of response needed, right? So framework was built with the best intentions, and also there is errors and flaws within everything. So with that, this school, this community, same community have built and broke me in the most beautiful ways. And we walked in and the mom was sitting there. And I remember inside me being like, I should go introduce myself because I know what that's like to be on that other side. I know what that's like to sit in that spot. You have these professionals in your space knowing things about you and you don't even know who they are or their why of showing up. And I had someone who I asked, like, should I go say? And they're like, no, just, we'll just meet. We'll see him in the meeting space. And I remember that felt so wrong to me inside. That was not in alignment of my values. And I felt like that just icky feeling in my gut and knew that is not how we show up. And full circle, by the end of it, we were able to bring community together. I was able to sit alongside that mother and her child and walk that walk with them in a way I knew was in alignment with what healing meant, even if it was against what the status quo tells us to do. So I could still shown up within that status quo, being trauma informed, saying the right things, doing the right things too, but walk in a space of healing requires a different level of intention and connection that I think sometimes you have to break out of, again, that status quo practice in which we've been taught and built and embedded. So just finding those moments. But with that, to find those moments, it really starts with the implicit, and those are your own mental models. And so within that transformative change that we are seeking, to be implicit and to hold yourself accountable as well for what is coming up. And this is not just for you, but it's for everyone at the table. So you are yourself and responsible for that. And it is also very, very important to identify the mental models within everybody that is there. So if I'm thinking of a reunification process, if I'm thinking of somebody who's transitioning from any form of incarceration or care, inpatient, it doesn't even matter. They're reintegrating, reunifying back in their school community. There's a collective mission that we all need to understand the foundation. What is our collective mission here together, and who all shows up in what spaces? Because there's different positionalities in which mental models show up. And so in order to even step into that implicit place, we also need to identify, why are we even here in the first place? What is our why? Because people are going to have different intentions, whether they are explicit about it or not. And so being at the root in your team, who are your stakeholders and rights holders? We often talk about stakeholders. We don't talk often about rights holders. And I think that's a really important shift and important to acknowledge, especially when you get to the very explicit side of who are your rights holders, who has a given right to be here because they are directly impacted. When we do policy work, if we're doing policy work around juvenile justice reform, you think of stakeholders, but who are the rights holders? Those are the people who are directly impacted by this change and how it's made and the impact it's going to have on them. That is their given right. So it is the same when we're walking, whether it is a small space or a big space. Who are our rights holders here? Investigate your own internal preconceived ideas or biases. There has been many moments of where I've walked alongside that path of the reunification with a youth and family into school. And already I can tell there's certain frameworks of thinking that individuals have because of their experience, whether it's an experience with this individual or it's experience with somebody who maybe has a similar record to them, whatever it may be. It is hard for them to maybe understand at certain moments, how do you step away and acknowledge where is that bias and preconceived idea showing up versus how am I seeing this person and family for the whole human that they are coming into this space. The youth and family internal work Also having relationships with those that you're serving and that you're working alongside. What is their relationship with their school community or the community that they're living within? Having that, building that trust and understanding that background helps us then navigate those different spaces. Again, many examples of school communities to where maybe even they had a harmful relationship with a sibling, and then that youth that's coming out is supposed to go back in, and there's just certain ways we have to navigate those conversations to protect that well-being of that youth and family, and not continuously put them in situations of harm, because we see that happen where harm is perpetrated on them unintentionally. And so having that understanding and that relationship really helps us show up within that space to know what mental models they're coming in with as well. And identifying what they envision their education experience to look like. What we might think the education experience should look like might not align with theirs. And so again, really getting at the root, and that's not just for the youth, but their family as well. What do they see that experience being? What in a dream world would they want for themselves? And how do we navigate with our power and within our role to help create that space? And
Can I
then
add, Lane, can I add on to that?
please.
I just cannot emphasize how important it is, that piece, that last piece that Lane just spoke on, identifying what they envision their education experience to look like. I feel like my entire experience in education, and I think about my experience as a student when I was a student, has been we have to put student voices first. We have to center student voices, and we have to listen to student voices. And I feel like a lot of times we say that, but what does that look like in action? And so if we are in those spaces where we really do have an impact on hearing student voices, creating space for them, calling them to the table, create nothing for us without us. There should be no programming or no nothing being created for young people or for youth without their input, without their seat at the table. And so when we say identifying what they envision, not only identify it, but actually put that into walk that walk, right? Put that into action and really create a space for young people at the table. I know when I've been doing threat assessment work and school safety work, one thing I've always been advocating for is how do we get this information out to young people? They're the ones at the front lines. They're the ones that are impacted first. How do we do a threat assessment that is age appropriate when we're talking about situations and scenarios and experiences, but also gets the point across, right? We live in a nation where gun violence is getting out of control. So maybe we need to change our tactics up a little bit. We're here training adults and doing all of these things, but maybe we should be training young people too. So creating seats at the table and pulling our young people in, what it looks like and what it is in actuality and reality are two different things. And so I just really wanted to drive that point. And I hope I did that. I'm gonna pass it back to Lee.
Yes. Yeah, I love this. Again, this is why we're here. Because this is the magic, is this space. And I saw in the chat also IEP meetings and centering students, 100% yes. It is all integrated into one. How many IEP meetings I have been in where the school unintentionally, again, I don't want to assume that there's intentional harm, and also there's work that always needs to be done, but I've seen jargon being used, language being used, and they walk through this meeting without even stopping and reflecting. And I've had a mom sit with me and be like, Miss Lane, like, I can't read. Can you read this to me? Can you break this down for me? After they just expected this family to sign these papers and agree upon these things and not even knowing. And we often forget, we're so quick, especially if you're in that framework of shifting and making movement, to pause and bring it down and just to reflect, how are we showing up in this space? And so it shows up in many spaces where we see that, but IEPs especially, where is that youth and family's voice? But also to have that voice, they often need to have that knowledge, right? And so we can't hoard that. We need to empower that. Erica, I see your hand up. Please feel free to jump in.
Hello, my name's Erica. I'm a restorative justice case manager specialist in Louisville, Kentucky. I work on a preventative project in 10 middle schools. I have some experience within the juvenile system myself when I was 10 years ago. But I would also like to point out that these IEP meetings, or even having these families participate in court proceedings. A lot of times the parents don't understand either, whether that's a language barrier. I see a lot of language barriers. I think that's what my dad experienced. Just educational barriers. A lot of our families, you know, to assume that they can read is crazy. Um, and I just think there's barriers within the parents, the adults, and then if there's barriers within the adults, then that trickles down to the kids. And I think a lot of times we forget about those type of barriers for the adults. In the wordings in these IEP meetings. If the child's confused, well, if the parent is confused, then I'm sure the child is confused, and we just never stop and just think about those type of things.
Erica, thank you for thank you for showing up today. Two, thank you for sharing your voice on what you do in your day-to-day, but also in your lived experience too. I love when people can come in, represent like this is all of me. So thank you for modeling that. And again, emphasizing we often forget the parents and the families. And it's not just the youth, but it's everybody. It is all hands on deck, regardless of the relationship, but understanding too their needs and being able to advocate for that and acknowledge. But to do that, we also have to have relationship. And I think sometimes that's where systems can lack. So no, we could spend all day talking. I'm gonna go through this kind of quickly, but I think that when we look at the different values of transformative change, we look at empathy, hope, these you said when we talked about healing. And at the core of that is safety. For me, even threat assessment, we talk about safety a lot. School safety, I get outreach for crisis team. What's school safety? What does school safety really mean? When we think of school safety or safety of who, how are we centering that? And what all does that mean? Because to have true safety, that is where you feel physically safe, emotionally safe, and psychologically safe. So when we look at our systems as a whole, who is feeling like they don't have that psychological safety as they show up in these spaces, or that physical safety, because there is different safety measures being implemented that don't always protect all students and families. And we need to acknowledge that so we can get at the core of if my youth, my kid, or whether it's someone I'm working with or my own life, doesn't feel physically, emotionally, psychologically safe, they're not going to learn. They're not going to take in information. That's just not how we work as humans. And so in order to really shift, we need to center those three areas. Nazia, do you want to add?
Yes. And I think this might go without saying, but oftentimes it doesn't. So I will say it again. How we define certain words as adults may not also be the same way young people define their words as well. So making sure that when you are defining safety, physical, emotional, psychological safety, that the definition that you have and the examples that you have reflect those of the youth that you're working with. We don't want to just assume what physical safety and emotional safety looks like for someone. I can't tell you how many times growing up as a young Black hijab wearing Muslim woman, my emotional and psychological safety was violated more times than I could count because I wasn't asked what my home experience was like, what was acceptable for family, what wasn't, what I wanted my family to know, what I didn't want my family to know. And so safety looks different for different people, depending on where you come from, depending on your culture, depending on your religious background, your sexual preference, all these different things, your identity, all of these different things. And so just making sure that we're careful and not making assumptions, and just asking those questions. And sometimes it might be silly to ask those questions. What does emotional safety mean to you? But getting those silly, quote unquote, silly, uncomfortable questions out the way makes the work that much more transformative, that much more effective. So put in the work that's needed now, so that we can get the results that we want, because this really truly does work. I know we're getting some action in the chat, but I can't see and look at the video all at the same time.
Gloria, see your hand up. Gloria, do you want to jump in?
Thank you for allowing me this opportunity. My name is Gloria Bean. I'm the clinical administrator at the University of Tennessee Health Sciences Center. I work for the Center for Youth Advocacy and Wellbeing. And I just recently read a study from the Government Accountability Office, as we were talking about safe spaces for students in school, that particularly focused on African-American girls. And it talked about how they accounted for more of the disciplinary processes, even though they only account for 15% of the school population. They account for 45% of out-of-school suspensions, 37% of in-school suspensions, 43% of expulsions. So as we're talking about a safe space, we're not recognizing sometimes that the way that our students come to school and how they interact may be a result of, as you know, as we were talking about, some things that are happening in the home. And if you're not culturally aware or culturally sensitive to how people react to their ACEs, or right, their adverse childhood experiences, then you're looking at it as oppositional defiant disorder. You're looking at them as disrespectful. You're looking at them as disruptive, as opposed to trying to understand what it is that is behind what you're seeing as a, and I'm putting in quote, maladaptive behavior, because it's not the norm. Well, maybe the home life isn't the norm. So this is how they are able to kind of express themselves. They don't know how else to say something. And that looks different than what mainstream thinks it should look.
Whew, Gloria, can you drop that in the chat? Someone else had asked to share the reference. I wrote it down, but if you don't mind sharing, that would be incredibly appreciated.
Yes, please.
I
Absolutely.
just thank you. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for sharing what you do, but also the importance and the numbers behind it, because we can talk all day, but when you see, and also data, you know, everything with caution, and at the same time, we can't ignore the truth in what's happening. So, yes, everyone's asking for the resource. All right.
Yeah, thank you, Gloria. Thank you.
You're welcome. There's also, I'm sorry to interrupt, there's also a documentary out that also touches on that. And I will see if I can find that link as well. But the study, it's like an 85-page study. I'll drop the link in for the study as well as from the NPR article.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you. We're going to go into, I'm going to talk real quickly because we're going to run through this. The relationship and connections. I'm sorry, my slides are not adding up. Empowered dynamics, but I could definitely speak on this. So as far as relationship and connections and power dynamics go, we're gonna make it short and sweet just for the sake of time, but that's the semi-implicit work. That is how we operate in community together. So power dynamics, again, and how we show up, we see power hoarding, even what we've already shared in this space is into our different roles and how we come together and what story does that tell and who has power within those spaces and who doesn't. But in order to do that, again, you have to understand the connections, the why, and the purpose behind, and also being able to be okay breaking that down. Something that Gloria shared that sparked this idea for me where the semi-implicit work can really happen. This is a true example. Sometimes we're in spaces, if you work with youth and family, you might be in different spaces behind closed doors where things are said and language is used in ways. I know something, Gloria, you said the word disruptive, and that stuck with me because we've heard that so many times. And so there's language changes. This is also where trauma-informed but healing-centered comes in when we think of person-first language. And where do you have power to shift those narratives? I'm a personal believer in my life. What I'm speaking is coming back. And so if I'm in a shared space and we're talking about a situation with a youth and family or a school, and I hear language such as disruptive, people might think because of their systems and status quo thinking that there's language that's okay to use because the youth and family aren't present, and 100% that is our role to stop and be like, can we change that? And really pull them into like why we need to shift our thinking and how that's showing up, because we're speaking that into existence. We're speaking negative things that just within our power and control, we have to stop behind closed doors. And there's a lot of times where I know for myself, I've heard things that are then also reflective of my own lived experience. How you're talking about that also speaks true to the life that I lived or that my family's lived or my friends lived. And that's something, you know, we need to be able to use our power within those relationships to address that semi-implicit change. Nazrin, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I would actually just want to share a quick anecdote. So I know Lane was able to share earlier just a little bit about my background. But as of recently, over the last like 3, almost 4 years, I've been working in school safety and threat assessment. and just as a school safety and threat assessment consultant. And essentially what my role is that I support schools K through 12 in King and Pierce County around all things threat assessment. So when a kid makes a threat, brings a weapon to school, they reach out to us, we assess the situation, we bring partners to the table to assess, is this a high risk situation? Is what's the plausibility of this situation actually taking place? And I remember one of the first couple threat assessments I did, my colleague and I were at a middle school supporting a student who I believe at the time was a 7th grader, and they were doing a threat assessment on this kid who was just super quote unquote violent. He was aggressive, he was getting in fights, never had brought in weapons to school or directly threatened anybody, but he had just behaviors that were escalating, and so the school felt concerned and were out of options, and so had conducted a threat assessment. Long story short, at one point or another during the meeting, we were talking about how the students' behavior is continuing to escalate, and how there are concerns and potentially opportunities or times where school staff may need to call the police and to utilize that as a resource. And the assistant principal who was in the room sitting next to me at the time, who happened to be a white woman, said that I've done it before. I can pretend to be scared and call the police on him anytime. And I remember hearing that and just how it landed on my body and how harmful it was, because we're doing a threat assessment on a young Black kid, and just how in a moment of seconds, the vibe and the mood in the room just changed, and nobody said anything in the moment. I like to think a lot of us were kind of just taken aback and shocked. We did end up saying something after the meeting and looking back, but there are so many opportunities and times where our bias impact how we interact with our students and the livelihood of our kids. And when we're talking about threat assessment, I mean, this is no different in Washington State. It's common across the US, but you do a threat assessment, and this assessment is staying in the student's file for up to 7 years, depending on where you're at. And it follows you throughout your educational career. And so the impact and the danger of what we're exposing our young kids to, in some of these harmful systems that were never created for them, never made for them, is very dangerous. And so we are in a place of privilege and a place of power when we're in these spaces advocating for kids. It's important for us to put our bias aside and really deal with the facts, what we're talking about, what we're dealing with, because ultimately the idea behind this threat assessment, the idea behind this training, the idea behind all of this is how can we better support students? How can we better support young people, and reacclimate them back into the world? And so our policies, our practices, our relationships, our beliefs, all of these can have such a detrimental impact on young people. And so we always have to be staying on top of it, getting trainings, interacting with other people, talking with other people, but most importantly, being courageous and being brave to push back in moments like that, but also to be accepting when somebody pushes back on you if you are a person in that moment showing bias. Lane, I'm gonna pass it back to you. I'm sorry, I know we're running out of time.
This is good. And to be intentional too, I've been in threat assessments before where we had a local organization that was essentially this family's rights were being violated. And we have a local organization where they're a law firm where they help represent students and families when their education rights are being violated. And in the middle of that meeting, regardless of my role, but handed that family over that information and said, you need to call this resource because this is not within your right. And it's dangerous and scary sometimes to be in that place and knowing within your professional role. And I understand, I do. And I'm not saying go out and do that, but I know for myself in that moment, that was within my power. When we see semi-implicit, that was within my power. And so what is within your power and being able to recognize that and to also own that, just like Nazarene said, in that space, it was within someone's power to speak in that room on what was just said and shared. As far as where threat assessments are offered, not every state offers threat assessments. And a Nazarene if you want. The intention was to essentially end punitive school discipline. Again, it was a prevention strategy that there's errors within everything.
Yeah. So just to touch on that comment just briefly, like Lane said, not every state offers threat assessment, but there are some states that are legally required to offer it. So Washington State passed a legislation back in 2019, House Bill 1214, that essentially just required schools to come up with non-firearm safety measures to address students' concerns. And one of those things was threat assessments and putting a process in place. So if you want to just put your email in the chat, I can follow up with more information if you are interested in that.
I'm going to, speaking of policies, we're going to move into some structural changes, which is explicit. And I know some people are jumping off. For those of you who are saying like the end is the best part. So, well, I think so at least, because that's when we get to hear you're so what, and we'll get there. So we'll go through this quick, as quick as I can. I know we like to, Nazar and I like to talk, we get passionate. So policies, when we think of our policies, we need to think of protection of people and who are our policies, who are they protecting and why? So an example of this is there was some policy work that happened in Washington State where essentially every school was required to have a suicide prevention policy and protocol. My passion, my background has been in juvenile justice. However, this role excited me because it still gets to the core of behavioral health and we could step into these conversations. But the way the policies were written, often, again, it's protection of who? Is it protection so the school's not held liable? Is it protection so the staff's not held liable? Or is it protection of our students and their safety, their emotional, psychological, and physical safety? And so when we see different policies come into play, we need to reflect on who are they protecting and why? And also, again, who are our rights holders that are had a given right to be at that table to help with that policy. And then if you look at your reunification process that your schools or communities that you work with, what is that process? And what are some of the policies in place? I know for myself, again, knowledge is power. So if I didn't know, I was going to find out what is the student's right in this experience and how do we educate them? That way, one, we can walk that walk and be that advocate, but also help empower them to know those skills. Where do you look for this stuff? What is an IEP? What is a 504? What is the allocated time that a school has to respond when you put in this request? There is certain things in which I know for myself, I was never educated around this. Probably would have helped me at many moments in my life, but how do we help empower our families through those policies in which they could use for their power? And then practices, accountability, documentation. This is something that I know schools in my experience loved documenting, right? But again, it's protection of who. So I also would document and I'd have my own plan. Like if we have an educational plan and goal, who is responsible for what here? And how are we also putting that on paper? So there's mutual accountability for this reunification process on all sides. And so finding a system that works for you, also being transparent in that system too, especially when working with youth and families. This might be a given, but I think sometimes it's forgotten, is educating our youth and families on when we're writing stuff down, what is the why? Even data, if you do data in your programming, you might not know where that data goes or why, but finding out and letting your youth and families that you work with in the community know, like this is where this information goes. Because again, I know for me, I didn't want those pieces of my story in my life just thrown out for everybody not knowing why. And we need that information as systems. Data tells us something, but doesn't tell us everything. And I think a lot of times our families are exploited not knowing what data is being collected on them. So continuously being accountable and sharing that as well. And then again, identifying who is represented at the table during the reunification process and what are their expectations. So who is all there and why? There's a lot of times where you just have your traditional model where it's a school, youth, and family versus do they have a community mentor? Do they have a community advocate? Do they have other systems involved? Because chances are if they're multi-system involved, they're having to go bring the same information and answer the same questions to multiple streams, which is absolutely exhausting and feels very depleting and discouraging for our youth and families. And then the last piece, the resource flows, both on a micro and macro level. Where are our resources going? What resources do we have? Not just for our direct service, but our system service as well. So identifying from the micro level, what are the assets and resources of who's supporting the family's reunification process? So as a family, what is happening, what resources do they have and do they not have that we can help embed, and then a macro, again, what resources of our organization. So you might have a certain amount of staff, and traditionally you staff this amount of staff for this amount of youth and families, versus really being adaptable in your practices to understand some families might need some more support or some flexibility, and that's okay. That's the beauty in centering healing, is meeting them where they're at. Dazrin, did you want to expand on any of this?
No, I think you touched on that really well.
I am catching up in the chat, and I agree and appreciate everything that has been shared. Sorry. So many gems coming through.
Yeah, a lot of
So
resources too.
yeah, I want to give time for people to reflect. So we do have some reflections, and then we have some closing just questions that we want to ask you all. So reflection, the first thing is, do not dismiss the power of hope. We hear that a lot, and it sounds a little cliche, maybe, I don't know, or overused, watered down, I don't know what you want to call it, but it's very true. It's very true that in the most hopeless spaces that I have been in, when you can be that person that gives that sense of hope, that changes people's lives. You know, I have worked alongside youth who are looking at 20 to 60 years of time and having to navigate those systems, working and walking that walk alongside their families. How do you navigate losing your kid to the system? What is that process? And when you can find those bits of hope, change is made. I've seen so much transformation within individuals and within families by just helping bring in that hope, that light, that whatever it is that you have power to do. And even if it's just sitting with them in that space that feels very powerless or very hopeless, and walking that walk. And so that can change lives. And I truly believe that. And I've seen that happen. This is a continued practice that requires time and consistency. We're never a perfect piece in this work. It requires us to continuously do our own reflections. I know even for myself in my day-to-day, there was moments just recently where I showed up in a space and I didn't show up as my best self. And I had to sit and I had to process that, and I had to process, where did that come from and why? And work through that, and also know, like, that is part of the work, is we keep doing better. We keep doing that, and holding ourselves accountable and holding each other accountable too. It goes along with the second one. What is your own reflection of how your implicit bias is showing up within your role? Not just within your role, but this is everything. This is not our 9 to 5. This is our 24/7. Like, walk this walk in and outside of when you're at work and home. And then lean on your community as an asset as well. When we think of, we hear so much about ACEs and adverse childhood experiences, where when we look at positive childhood experiences, right? Like that's everything when it comes to Healing Center. We look at those strengths, but that's us too. So what are your assets? What are your protective factors? What are your positive adult or childhood experiences that you can lean on to continuously to care for yourself also? And then this was a youth that just recently we were talking about mentors. We were doing a group on mentorship and why they thought they made a good mentor or not, and what that definition was for them. And I thought this was so simple, but also just a great reminder. A mentor to me is someone who shows up for me no matter what I'm going through. They're there not because they have to be, but because they want to be. Nazrin, do you want to add anything to this slide before we open it up?
I can't reiterate the importance of just walking along young people and them not feeling like they're alone. All it takes is one person. And I know I've been in positions where I have been that only person in the corner of so many of my students. And the messages I've received and the thanks I've gotten after the fact is beyond anything that I can ever explain. Like when I say this is life or death work, I'm not just saying that. We are in this business to save lives, and being that person and being in a position to be that person is so vital. So if you don't have any mentees, go find a youth to mentor, because there are plenty of them around who need it, and you have so much knowledge and expertise and I hope time to give to them. So please utilize that and just give back to the community as much as you can. Don't underestimate the power of one voice and one person.
So there's a
Don't
few
let this
words.
work bog you down. Don't let this work bog you down.
No, you got to keep that spirit. Got to keep that. Yes. You had said something. You said life or death, and then you also said something about giving thanks, and that coming back to you, that full circle, which we don't always see. I know for myself, there's so many youth and families that I've worked with where you don't always know. You don't know what happens. Many of them I do. I've also lost a lot of youth and family to the system and to homicide and overdose and those things. Like that's real. That's part of this work. We can't dismiss that. Just this last weekend, I finally took on cleaning my office and organizing, and I found something, and I have it up, but I took it down before this because I was hoping we'd have time so I could read it to you. And then Nazarene just said a few in this. It's a spoken word. I'm not going to read it. Is great. Is the original author. His name is Noah Schultz. He's a good long-term friend of mine. He was actually incarcerated down in Oregon. He served juvenile life there. And while he was there, he made a documentary, did all the things. But it's not so much about him as it is about hope and healing and how he did that for himself, but also for many others, and how many youth and families that are in the system, they have that is what they do, and they continuously do that, and they continuously strive. So I want to read this to you all before we go into closing. Again, I'm not going to read it as great as he probably would, but it's called Speak Life. As I got ready one morning, looking for my car keys, my headphones inhabited the songs of Damian Marley. He spoke to me clearer than as if he had personally called me. He said, "Speak life," and my mind paused as if it had froze in time, like the purpose of my work had been summarized in one line. Speak life. And I thought about all the differences in political views and how we are subconsciously fed who should hate who, and the social constructs that influence mainstream views, making my mind write up a task list of all the things I should do. And at the end of that list, I was able to conclude I am not in control of what other people say and do, but I can choose. I can choose to do things different, to lift labels with language that is targeted and specific. Like, hey, you there, you're really not that dumb, kid. This isn't your subject. Your life is not over. Your life is a project. Same day, I listened to a podcast. Sound as touch was the topic on Radio Lab. You see, our words and our voice do more than make noise. They touch the recipient through vibration. So ask yourself, what kind of message are you relaying? Is it fear? Is it love? What are the words that you are saying? Because they matter. They can build a person up or shame them for their difference. Speaking must be an act that is disciplined. Our words are the tools that our children are continued with. So speak life. I will put the author's name in the chat. He has a book as well of different poems he wrote while incarcerated. Sorry, I just saw that comment, but yeah, I just think it's really important as we talk about language, we talk about how we show up, to remember that you do have that is within your control, to continuously speak life into others in the work that you do. So before we close out today, we have 15 minutes, and I want to hear you out loud. I want to hear you in the chat. What is your so what? And when I say that, I can't tell you how many trainings and things and webinars I go to. I take all these little notes, but at the end, it's like, so what? How do I move this beyond my paper of what I wrote down and into action? So I'd love to hear from you, whether it's one thing that stuck with you or something you're going to change. What is your so what that you're leaving here with today? We keep loving and fighting and doing what's right. A new framework of reunification, and with a new way to look at my words. Keep on fight. I still practice changing my language about the people we work behind closed doors when the client isn't present, and sharing with others that they should shift theirs too. Empowerment. Then I need to remind myself to remove my ego and acknowledge my good intention.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I'm trying to go back into the chat. That last one was fire. Where did it go? I'm opening it right now. Where did it go? The idea of talking about families or people behind their closed doors or not there. Absolutely. There's this, we live in this society of like toxic gossip culture, and it feeds into everywhere, big or small, right? Like we talk about, I think the first exposure we have with gossip is school, right? In elementary school and middle school and high school. And it's just interesting to see how it manifests into adulthood and into the work world, and then how just unfun it gets and how harmful it can be, and how a lot of times you're the only one in the room thinking this isn't okay. So thank you so much for that. Words matter. And it's important for us to be courageous. That's literally all it comes down to at the end of every day. The difference between you and somebody who said something is the ability to be courageous, and be brave. So thank you for reiterating that.
There's so many good, just, oh.
I want to frame all of these.
Anyone want to speak out, or anyone have any questions as well? I keep the good coming. We understand, we want to see these so whats. We want to see this leave this space.
My name's Amber, and I'm the one that made that comment about changing language. Actually, it's like I'm getting an emotional reaction because we often think that, it's okay, we're jaded, it's just how we talk, that it's in this lighthearted nature, but it's not, because when we're saying things about clients that are judgmental or biased or whatever, we're sort of like reinforcing that is the way that we see them. Even when they're not around. So it's super harmful and it's not healing. And I really, really appreciate that being brought up. And it's not only my responsibility to do that for myself, it's also my responsibility to like be curious and like, bring it to light when others are speaking that way. So
Thank you, Amber. Erica, I see your hand, please.
Hello. Is this some type of training that can be offered? I know that there was 4 different dates, but like to like stakeholders in the DJJ, or even something that could be presented within a juvenile detention center, some type of, to get their feedback to see if like this is how they're feeling, what would they like to add, even it being some type of table between the DJJ and those incarcerated in detention centers, because I feel like they never, I don't know if it's because they're like, well, we don't need to be at a table with kids, but ultimately these adults are making decisions on kids and sometimes never get to see the kid, but their decisions are impacting kids and families. So I don't know, or even presenting this to families to participate in.
Yeah, thank you. So this training that you saw today is just a big arching of one that I've done in big and small communities directly. So I frame it in different ways depending on the audience. If it's directly with a juvenile justice and say detention center, so I look at their policies, I look at those things, and I frame it in the sense of their community and get more specific with your data and whatnot versus the macro right here, right now. How can this hit everyone regardless of where they're coming in? And then even on a family level, that's a whole different experience as well, but it's the same thing of where are we, how do we get these tools? So it can be offered. I don't know, Crystal, if you would like people to reach out to you, but as far as myself and Nazarene go, like this is something that we've been doing this training for a while and we embed it in different ways. We match it to the community in the way that is best for that community and what they need. But it's something that somehow, some way needs to be talked about.
I would even go as far as, because I'm a language advocate as well, just because my daddy's he spoke Spanish most of the time that I would, when I had the incident with the juvenile justice 3 times, and I just feel like he was left out of the loop. So I would even go as far as, providing this training in different languages for those that speak Spanish or speak Kinyarwanda, or I just feel like a lot of times they can't participate in these informationals because things aren't offered for them. So just even a flyer being in English, that could make a lot of families and kids not participate. It's not catered to them. So I would be curious to see their perspectives as well. Cause that's probably scary. Things aren't in their language. They're not understanding, but all of these decisions are impacting them.
Thank you, Erica. Anyone else want to share out or ask questions? This is my favorite part. All right. Before we close, please feel free to continuously jump in or join in the chat, but I do want to hold myself accountable in some acknowledgements. I first want to acknowledge you all. Thank you for being here. Thank you for showing up in this shared space and showing up as your whole self. I am a goofy, just like my life is a little chaotic, but I show up real and how we are, and that's what I want you all as well to show up in your day-to-day. So thank you. I appreciate you. Nazarene, thank you so much. Like I said at the beginning, like I have seen her shake rooms in the most beautiful ways. And so thanks for doing that today as well with others. I also want to acknowledge that several youth that I mentioned and the impact that they've had on me. They're not as much anymore. Some still are, but most of them are grown. But then also just even my own family and Evelyn Clark, she's done a lot of work to help build some of this framework and been a good mentor to me. And so I just want to give that acknowledgement to her. Nazarene, I don't know if there's anyone you want to acknowledge in this space before we wrap
Yeah,
up.
absolutely. I just want to acknowledge you first and foremost. Like, thank you so much for just presenting this opportunity and allowing to bring my voice into this space, and to all those who've been listening and engaging. I just want to acknowledge y'all for being here. It's not easy being on a computer and being on Zoom a lot of times. So thank you for that opportunity. And Crystal, thank you as well for giving me the opportunity to do this and show up. I know it wasn't easy, but thank you so much. Like, these are the moments that fill our cup and allow us to go back and be the fighters that we are. So this work means so much to us, and I really appreciate the work that you do as well.
Yes, everybody, give Crystal and the NTAC team all of your love, because they have had to deal with us crazy presenters and some of our chaos and have such a hard job. Logistics are
Yes.
not much, and they're rocking it. So acknowledgement and love and appreciation to NTAC. There's going to be 3 more amazing sessions to follow. I believe 3. I think there's 4 total. And so first one,
Yeah.
great. But join the other ones to come. If you're not signed up, please register. And I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to pass it over to you, Crystal, if you want to close this out.
Yes, thank you, Nazarene and Lane, so much for such a wonderful presentation. It's been great working with y'all, and it was just a great kickoff to this wonderful series. So thank you so much. Excited for the rest of the sessions, y'all. So I'll probably wrap us up with that at the end, but there's a few things to get through. But just want to really say thank you to you both for such an awesome presentation. Love when there's presentations that kind of just like end also with like some reflections, and I'm just looking forward to the reflection that I'll continue after. So thank you all for joining and being here with us today. Please look for the follow-up email after today's session for folks who weren't able to or for folks who may have joined a little bit after the beginning. Just so you all know, you all provide a certificate of completion for this event in the follow-up email, as well as a copy of the presentation and a recording of this event as well. Next slide, please. As you may have seen in the chat, Joanne put I'm having trouble. Oh, yeah. If you scroll a little bit up, because there's been some messages afterwards, but there is in the chat a link to the survey. We really appreciate your feedback. It's super important and part of our quality control. And so it's just great to receive feedback from you all. If you could please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts. There's 3 ways to access the survey. One, like I mentioned in the chat, thank you, Joanne, for putting that in there. After after the Zoom ends, it'll also automatically pop up, and then you'll also be provided a link in the follow-up email that's sent after the session. So please take a few minutes to fill that out. We greatly appreciate it. And next slide, please. And of course, stay connected. Somebody asked, I think it was Erica Vivas, I think maybe, who asked about other presentations. That's a great way to start. I know Joanne put it in the chat as well, but that you can also access our website for upcoming events, archived recordings where this will be there as well. You can request support, publications and resources, and newsletter signups. And of course, the different handles for social media. Feel free to give a follow on there and get social with us. And then the last slide we'll leave it there with our contact information. Feel free to reach out. But again, just thank you so much, Lane and Nazrin, for all your work on this presentation and providing so much great information, insightful information, and just beautiful information around healing-centered reunification. Again, it was a perfect kickoff to the series. We'll have 3 more sessions with a total of 4 sessions within the series. So please join us next Tuesday at the same time. And yeah, thank you all. I hope you all have a great day, a great October, and we hope to see you in the coming weeks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.